Blood, blood, blood for your bones! Too many bones? Not enough blood? Call Blood Bone! Ribs, skulls, spines, even certain tiny ear bones. The leg bones connected to the blood bone!
Hello and welcome to a very spooky episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and... Oh. What's this? Someone at my door. Let me go get it. Creak? Oh, what are you dressed as, little boy? Are you wishing I chose a different intro that I had lined up for you?
I'm dressed as an audio engineer from the 1980s.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And why that?
I just have a mullet. That's all.
Oh, because of your haircut? That was a little clunky. Let me try my other intro for you, and we'll see if that one goes a little better.
I didn't have an idea. Somebody was just talking about
it's hard
audio engineer haircuts on a podcast I was listening earlier to today, and so that was the first thing I thought of.
It's hard when I just put you on the spot and say, "Quick, make a joke," which is kind of uncharitable improv. Let me try something else here a little bit.
It's normal improv. I'm just not that good at it.
Here we go. Let's just do this. Hello and welcome to a very scary episode. Fuck.
I made that same typo on the website the other day.
Hello and welcome to a very scary episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, checking all of his candy for drugs, but then throwing out all the candy without drugs in it, Maddox.
Yet again, another year with no drugs.
No drugs in candy. Turns out people don't give away free drugs. It's not a good business model.
It's not well, then again... I mean, there's that whole first taste is free idea.
First taste is free, but if they don't know where they got it, it kind of defeats the whole purpose. You're not going to go back to that house the next night and be like, I'm fiending for another kid-size Snickers bar because you put some Coke in it or whatever.
It's an interesting strategy, though.
If you were to cut Halloween candy with drugs, what would be your drug of choice?
I mean, so let's just establish for the record, I am not particularly into drugs or particularly knowledgeable about them.
You're probably about as into drugs as you are into candy, which is to say not very much.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Okay,
so if I'm going to choose between the two, I think it would have to be probably, a Heath bar with mushrooms. I think, toffee and psychedelics.
Psychedelics are good. I feel like maybe you just give those kids a little bit of ecstasy,
I don't know. I mean, it's already tough to be around children.
What about children that are really obsessed with the texture of the carpet?
Yeah, I don't know about that.
I really like the texture of that.
That's not exactly what
rug.
I have planned for my Halloween.
Yeah, and just to be clear, we don't condone drugging children on this show.
Absolutely not.
It does not need to be said, but we don't. This is our Halloween episode, Anthony. I'm not sure. Halloween's what, a Friday this year? A Thursday? I don't know when. It comes up before Halloween is the important part. And so we're going to cover some spooky topics and some not so spooky topics because it turns out it's hard to come up with a whole episode's worth of explicitly spooky topics.
Apparently.
We started a tradition last year of doing a Pack One Pick One from an Innistrad themed cube on our quote-unquote Halloween episode. I don't see why we shouldn't continue this tradition, and I want to just quickly apologize to everyone that sent in their Innistrad themed cubes to our Pack One Pick One list because I can only do one of them. I think I got 7 or 8 in the past couple months of people that are like, Halloween's coming up, do my Innistrad/horror themed cube. We can only do one. It's kind of a bummer.
You know what we could have done is we could just find the intersection of all those cubes and made a pack from it and then not told everybody whose cube it was.
That is a very interesting idea that we don't have time to pull off at this juncture before this episode goes out. Maybe next year.
It's the spookiest thing about that is I forgot that we've already been doing this podcast for more than a year.
Considerably more than a year. I mean, last week was episode 69. Did you hear?
Nice.
Yeah, that's pretty nice. The Innistrad theme cube that has won the random raffle. I didn't try and, pick favorites. I just kind of looked at the first one that popped up in the inbox when I was scrolling. Is Anthony's/Uber Bear's Horror Cube. It's a 360 card legacy cube. It's got a horror theme, Anthony, so I think a lot of the horror-related cards you might expect. From looking at this pack, there's a couple cards that aren't necessarily horror-themed, but I think some people would think were horrible to see in this pack. So maybe that tells you something. I'll read the pack, and we'll dive into the Pack One Pick One. Should I do it in my spooky voice?
Yeah, but I don't want to listen to that, so...
Okay, you can take your headphones off and go upstairs. All right, here we go. The pack is Hungry for More, Bloodgast, Mild Triton, Preordain, Daybreak Ranger, Midnight Reaper, Chaplain of Alms, Dryad's Revival. Curse of the Bloody Tome. Fateful Absence. My voice is changing as they go through the pack. Turns out voiceover work is hard. Armageddon. Living Death. Viscera Seer. Bonfire of the Damned. And Soul Swallower.
And for those of you who skipped ahead through that voiceover work, you can check out the card image gallery on the website and see the cards without having to listen to that.
Yeah. TLDR, check the website. What are you taking, Anthony? Or at least what are you interested in if you don't want to spoil what you're taking just yet?
So a couple things do stand out to me. There's lots of good spooky stuff here. I think what I need to do is get in the zone and decide what are my goals for this cube draft tonight. And I think it's the spooky draft. I want to draft something spooky, right?
Like land destruction.
Spooky is Armageddon.
That is the card I referred to that some people would say was horrible, even though it's not explicitly a horror. I guess it is kind of horror themed. Armageddon is not a good thing, but it's not like gothic horror. It's not like a gothic doomsday scenario.
So if we're going classic, like Living Death is classically spooky. It's also very powerful. It's also just a fun, exciting thing to play. So if we're just going for a fun, exciting, spooky draft, I think Living Death is a solid first pick. Midnight Reaper also hits on both the power level and the spookiness. I never thought about it, but it's this zombie that actually has a huge scythe, so that definitely stands out.
Zombie coming and going. He is a zombie that makes more zombies.
You know what? I think that I just want to draft zombies. Can I draft zombies in this cube? I can draft zombies.
Certainly hope so. I'm looking at 2 zombies in this pack, and it's the horror-themed cube, so I would certainly hope that is a possibility.
So I don't know if that is the optimal pick, but I really want to start on Midnight Reaper because it is a powerful card. It generates a lot of card advantage, and I think it's like a critical piece to making a zombie deck work where you have lots of creatures you're sacrificing and losing, and you draw a bunch of cards.
Yeah, if I was in the mood to spike this draft, I would just take the Preordain, probably. Armageddon.
Yeah, but it's not that spooky.
It's not. Armageddon is very polarizing, which is to say, some games it wins very handily that your opponent had no chance to ever do anything about it. And in some games, it is dead in your hand. If you're behind on board, or even at parity sometimes, you just can't cast Armageddon. And a lot of times you find yourself at parity in a situation where any other 4-drop would put you ahead on board. And now you just don't even have that option because you only have this play it when you're already ahead, win more Armageddon card. So even though that card has a very high ceiling, I rank it lower on power level overall than a simple Preordain, which goes in any of my blue decks. No build around required. But Anthony, I'm with you. It's a spooky cube. It's a spooky week. I'm just taking Living Death, though. Living Death is what I absolutely want to pack one, pick one in a cube like this. For those that don't know, Living Death, 3, black, it's a sorcery. And the rules text is somewhat complicated if you look at the Oracle text. Basically, you swap all creatures in play and all creatures in graveyards simultaneously on both sides of the board. So you get to ideally build some deck that is self-mill or a looting deck where you're just kind of churning through your library, dumping a bunch of stuff into your graveyard, and then you cast a Living Death, get them all back, and go nuts. Also works great with Enter the Battlefield abilities because obviously you can trigger those again. And a lot of times you can just use it as a wrath. If your opponent doesn't have any self-mill strategies and you have it in your opening hand, let them commit to the board and then wipe them all away. So that's the card I'm starting on first. I agree, Midnight Reaper, also spooky, but I love the build-around potential of a Living Death. So I'm going to take this early and just see if I can make it work. And if I can't, I'll have fun losing. I'll get the Living Death effectively probably once or twice throughout the entire 3-match night. And that'll be enough for me on a themed cube night.
Yeah, it is really a great thing to take early in the draft because it is a build around in a lot of ways. Although it does have those sort of like niche cases where sometimes it just is a wrath. So I think it's still like a reasonable card to include sometimes. But yeah, when you can really build around it is where it shines.
What do you think about Living Death in the irregular package of your regular cube, the rare module?
It might honestly be in there.
It should be, because I think it's the kind of card that I don't want to play with all the time, but sometimes I really do. It was in my cube for a while, and at 5 mana, it just becomes a liability at a certain speed where you can't really justify it. But in slower cubes, I love building a Living Death deck every once in a while.
All right, it's not in there yet, but I'll throw it on the scratch pad.
I'm taking Living Death. You are taking Midnight Reaper, which, for the record, is a 3/2 for 2 and a black that whenever a non-token creature you control dies, it deals 1 damage to you, and you draw a card. A nice little card advantage engine for any proactive deck, aristocrats deck, any kind of thing you got going on where you're sacrificing creatures or just attacking with them. We're not spiking the theme draft, Anthony.
I mean, I'm going to try to win. I think Midnight Reaper's really strong.
So, sometimes, most of the time, I'm in the mood to try and win, because most of the time that is the joy I get out of playing Magic. But especially with the themed cube, like, assuming this wasn't a cube that was in my play group I got to play regularly all the time, I'm just playing it once. I want to see what it's all about. I want to commit to the bit. I don't want to draft, like, blue-white control in the horror-themed cube.
Yeah, I think that's actually a huge factor that influences the way I'm going to draft a cube is how often am I going to do it?
Yeah.
If I'm going to draft the same cube many times, I want to, really like explore the boundaries, figure out how to draft it optimally. If I'm just going to draft it one, I want to make sure to not miss what the unique thing the cube is offering by, trying to go too deep on spiking it. I do want to actually explore what is that unique thing and make sure I get that experience.
Before we get to this vaguely related topic, if you want to send in a pack one, pick one to the show, you can mail it to mail@luckypaper.co with your name and pronouns, and we'll do it on the show. Great. Moving on.
If you have an American Thanksgiving themed cube, now is a great time.
I would love anyone has an American Thanksgiving themed cube. We just missed Canadian Thanksgiving. I think it was last week or something. I think it's really interesting that, to me, a lot of what I play in my cube just obviously comes down to my subjective preferences, what I like about Magic. And a lot of times, I just feel like I get my fill of playing with a given card. Like, when I first built my cube, the reason I wanted to build my cube was so I could play with Armageddon, Opposition, Primeval Titan, cards that I just...
Recurring Nightmare,
cards I just wanted to play that I had no other avenue to play in it. Parallax Wave is another great example of a card that was in my early iteration of my cube that I just really wanted to play. And as a cube designer, as you play your cube, right, we've talked before about the... What's the thing with the man steps in the river and what's it called?
I fucking hate that.
Why do you hate that so much?
It just bothers me.
Heraclitus. It's not Ship of Theseus, but it's related to the Ship of Theseus. Anyway, you're always changing as a player. Your cube is always changing. And honestly, while I can kind of rationalize the reason I've made the changes to my cube that I have, and largely cut a lot of the cards I just listed. I don't run Parallax Wave or Opposition or Upheaval or a lot of these cards anymore because it just my tastes have moved on. And I think it's very tempting as a cube designer to pretend or at least rationalize that you've somehow evolved beyond that. But I really think it's just that you got to play with it for a while and you're just kind of over it. So I see other players that have a cube that looks like mine looked 2 years ago, and I'm like, great, you're maybe at that phase that I was at, where you're just gotta play with these cards, never done it before, never drafted an Upheaval deck, want to see what it's like, want to get those reps in. Maybe you'll decide that you want to cut in the future, maybe you'll decide you want to go even deeper down that road, you'll learn more about what you like about the game. But I feel like a lot of people, they think that their journey is kind of universal. It's I've been through that chapter, and therefore I know you're someday going to be playing my kind of cube, and I feel like I'm more evolved or more further along in my journey than you are. And it's really just not the case. I think a lot of people just want to play with cards and then they kind of get their fill and move on.
Yeah, I think that the fact that there is not a value judgment there, sure, I would say parallel, you are also learning and growing as a cube designer and a Magic player. And
right.
In some ways you are maybe becoming more refined in your taste, but in a lot of ways you're just talking about sort of this fatigue. Maybe that's a little bit of a strong word, but it's, you just get your fill of a card. So the fact that...
Well, it's just we have, it would not be that fun to play the exact same limited set every single week forever.
Right.
Even though we like retail limited. So Wizards just prints new sets and keeps the sets churning out because that keeps the problem-solving novel. And cube designers, we just have to keep changing. It doesn't mean that necessarily where your cube was 6 months ago, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago is worse. It might be if you're growing it. To your point, there are probably other decisions about my cube design where I was not realizing my goals back then in ways that could have been more articulated. But you just got to change something. And I wish people would stop thinking about that change as always being a step forward. We talked about this a little bit with Jason, actually, where it's this perception that all change is better. And it's just no, change is different.
You just kind of want something different. Variety is the spice of life. Another phrase that I don't love, and I wish there was a better phrase for.
What don't you like about the phrase variety is the spice of life?
Maybe I just don't like phrases.
Yeah. That tracks.
Okay, great.
What's your favorite aphorism? Can you think of one you like at all?
I cannot think of a single one that I like.
Because the Heraclitus River one is one of my favorites. I think it's good.
I don't think it's good.
But you get it, though, right? Because, the rivers change and, the man has also changed. You get it?
Yes.
Maybe you don't get it. You must not get it.
I think about rivers a lot. So I think this is an interesting aspect of cube design, and I think it actually creates some, weird dissonance with players. I think it makes a lot of sense and follows a very clear pattern if you have a very consistent play group. And I think you'll get the same feedback, which, we have a consistent enough group. We've had some cards that have been requested must be removed from a cube or they will never play that cube ever again. That's come
people
up.
Have thrown down that gauntlet. I would say a few too much. Maybe people got to use that sparingly,
Nah, it's open
It's
the
effective.
floodgates.
As a cube designer trying to fill pods, it is effective.
But when you have a more rotating cast, it does sort of create these weird conversations where it's like, well, why isn't this here? Like, did it not play well? Was it like not powerful enough? And it's like, sometimes it's just like, well, there's so many options that could be a similar card like this, and we just wanted to try something a little bit different. And I think that, yeah, a lot of times players are coming assuming that you are making like a big value judgment, when often it's not really a value judgment at all.
Yeah, you had your fill of casting Burmaz, now it's time to cast Adeline for a while, even though the cards are very, very similar.
I would actually like to, having thought about that card a little bit more, play that in a multiplayer cube.
Yeah, it's kind of meant for that.
Yeah, like all Magic cards today.
Like all the Magic cards they make today. Yeah, I mean, a great example of this is that on the Cube Talk Discord, the user Agile Drunk is running a cube league where they're drafting some community cubes or cubes of people that are active on the Discord in a sort of rotation over the course of a couple weeks and tallying up games and stuff. And you can check out the Discord and see all the histories and deck lists and records there. So they ended up drafting my cube at a time I couldn't make the draft. So they drafted my cube without me. I wasn't there. And they all kind of came back. And these are, friends of ours from the Discord, people I'm acquainted with feedback about the cube, which I was, of course, very grateful for. But it's very striking to me how different their perception of my environment is from our local playgroup, which has paid my cube a lot of times in paper and isn't participating in that particular echo chamber of discussion that goes on in that particular Discord. And, they came out of it and were like, white aggro seems like it's way undersupported, which is a deck that I frequently hear from my regular local play group in person is oversupported and too good, and why do you like white aggro so much? And similarly, they're like, Luris is clearly broken. Like, at two players, I really respect these two players and think they're really smart, savvy cube designers and players. We're both like, Luris is a huge power outlier. The fact that you let people play it as a companion is broken. I don't understand how you think this is not a problem. Like, they weren't saying it disrespectfully. They were just like, it's weird that we'd see this so differently because it seems like a glaring issue in your environment, and the Luris deck did take down the 3-0 in this particular draft. And I don't think I've ever seen a companion Luris deck take a 3-0 in our paper drafts of my cube, which could just be variants, could be predilections of the players, but it's so striking how different those perspectives are. And I think I'm very grateful to have the perspectives of a lot of people from the Discord, from listeners to the show, from our local playgroup, which is, all things considered, pretty vast and pretty rotating. There's a lot of people that kind of come in and out and play cube with us. And I'm really grateful to have that vast perspective, because I think a lot of people play with the same group all the time. And it's very easy, I think, to start thinking, well, the dominant conversation, the dominant view of my environment must be how it is, because that's just how it always plays out. But the perception is huge. The bias that players bring to the table really changes how an environment plays out.
I think there's actually sort of two factors happening there. One is the echo chamber that you're talking about, where there's just these feedback loops when players think something is a powerful strategy, and they tell other players that. Those players will find ways to reinforce that, and there can be that sort of positive feedback loops that reinforces thinking about things in a certain way. The other thing that I think is different is just the preferences of the players. And so, I mean, in my own cube, I think an interesting example is there's one player who's been winning the cube pretty consistently and is convinced.
We had James on the episode, and he bragged about it on our live episode. So I think we can say it's James.
It's James, and he's convinced that a certain strategy is the optimal strategy, and it's way more powerful than anything else. And I do really wonder, I really take that as a valuable data point, but at the same time I wonder, well, maybe you're just the best at this environment and that's what you enjoy doing.
There's a lot of things
there's
that
this
could be
other
right.
complicated feedback loop or complicated bias that's easy to reinforce.
Yeah,
all that to say, it's just it's really hard to evaluate other people's input. It's really hard to evaluate a cube environment. It's hard to give good input. And that contrast of different groups of people interpreting this environment so differently. I mean, to me, that's just what is so exciting about Cube, is that
Absolutely.
It is still a very novel puzzle to solve. It's not just yep, I'll go get the list of top commons, go get the pick order. It's vastly, vastly disparate and difficult to solve.
And in that case, it could be, like you said, that maybe James is just a leveled up player, a little better than all of us, and so whatever strategy he decides to draft, he'll have success with. I've called that in the past the LSV problem, where everything LSV drafts on the MTGO Vintage Cube, he's like, well, this is obviously the best strategy. Look, my record's great. And it's yeah, you're also one of the best players of all time, queuing up against randos on MTGO that maybe are not even familiar with this cube and never played with these cards before. It's you could probably win most matches with a ham sandwich. So you're not really actually the best person.
Many he does while eating a ham sandwich.
That's true. But he's probably not the best person to be evaluating, what are the successful strategies in the cube, because he has one of the most biased perspectives on it as a huge outlier on the skill bell curve.
So did you take that advice, and has that influenced your approach to this environment, or your understanding of this environment at all?
What did I take to heart? So, I mean, there's an ongoing conversation about whether or not triple shock lands overpunish multicolored decks in my environment. That I have taken to heart quite a bit, and I have some changes planned in that milieu. I don't think Lurrus is broken in the sense that if differently minded, capable players sat down and drafted the cube back to back, and we just drafted it got drafted by 90 different playgroups across the world, that there would be an outsized win percentage represented by Lurrus companion decks. I do think it's a really powerful card. I like that it's a really powerful card that comes with deck building restrictions and limitations you have to work with. So I don't see myself cutting that anytime soon or erradicating it to say you can't play it as a companion. I think the card is cool and gives a lot of depth to aggro decks, so I don't really take that too much to heart. Yeah, I mean, I the answer is I listen to all feedback, right? And I think a lot of times what I'm listening for is not what people are saying. People oftentimes want to give feedback in the sense of here's the cards I think don't belong here or are too good, or here's the strategy I think is dominant. And that's not really what I'm listening for. What I'm listening for is what did you enjoy about this or not enjoy about this? And sometimes you got to kind of parse that out. But frankly, the Lurrus deck that this player drafted of the cube looked sick. It was a really good deck. Black-white aggro with Unearth for Lurrus. And people also tell me Unearth is no good. And then Unearth goes and is broken apparently with Lurrus. And it's yeah, the card's... that's what I want. I want people to think Unearth is bad, except, wait, we pair it with Lurrus. It's really incredible. So I don't know. I did not directly go and make any immediate changes to the cube based on the feedback, but it definitely got filed away in the sort of long tail of all the feedback I'm always collecting about my environment.
Yeah, I would hypothesize. So I would say I wouldn't be surprised if that is true and Lurrus is extremely busted. I think the two things I would hypothesize is that in our local Baltimore group, maybe we're still a little bit apprehensive about two-color aggro decks, which I think is really what it sounds like made that deck function really well. Just having access to still a deep card pool.
You can play Croxa with Lurrus.
You can't companion Lurrus, though.
Sure you can.
What?
Croxa only costs 2 mana.
Oh, I'm totally turned around. I'm somehow the two costs on it just flipped in my brain. That's rude.
It doesn't feel like you should be able to play a 6/6 that you know, but you can.
Yeah,
it's pretty
there's
cool.
Also obviously all the scalable things,
but you can't play Porcelain Legionnaire. So it's where it gives, it takes.
The other thing is, I think that maybe just speaking for myself, I'm always well, I have Liliana the Last Hope. Is it really worth companioning Lurrus to? I still have to pay 6 mana for it versus having this really, really strong Planeswalker is always a sort of evaluation that I struggle with, and I'm probably coming out on the wrong side of.
Yeah, I've played a companion Lurrus quite a few times in my cube, and it's been good, but definitely did not feel broken. It was this gives my deck a lot of depth. It gives it a late game that it wouldn't have otherwise. I really like that. I'm always thinking in my aggro deck, what am I going to do when I get stonewalled? And if you're, we've talked about this before, but if you're a deep red aggro deck, you have burn spells to eventually just go to face. If you're a white aggro deck, you can have a bunch of flyers or equipment to make your creatures big enough to still get through big blockers or whatever. If you're a black aggro deck, you can have all your threats be recurring. So if you eat a board wipe, you can just bring them all back and keep attacking. And I like that Lurrus is kind of a self-contained late game strategy where you can kind of stop thinking about the late game because you have Lurrus all the time, every single game. And you just say, now I'm taking every card that is good in all the other contexts because I have that late game base totally covered. I think it opens up interesting deck building considerations that you just wouldn't have with any single card otherwise, which is why I like the card so much.
Right. And going back to sort of one of the big motivations for playing Cube is just being able to play cards that don't really function in another context. And
right, maybe they're restricted in Vintage.
But even without being restricted, I think there's just the context really matters. And Lurrus in Ikoria Draft, well, maybe not Lurrus, but some of the other companions in Ikoria Draft versus in Constructed, I think are very different, where it's
yeah.
Kahira, you want to draft this dogs and cats and pets and whatever deck, and that's kind of interesting. But when you do it in Constructed, you're just oh yeah, I'm just going to ignore this restriction in a totally different way.
I have no creatures in my deck.
Lurrus, you're just going to say, well, I'm going to build this extremely linear deck based on this one individual strategy. Whereas in the limited environment, it's about, okay, this restriction really matters, and I do have to think about it, and when I take it, I'm going to drastically change the way that I'm going to continue the rest of the draft.
Yeah.
Which is what the companion mechanic was all about, and I think kind of failed in a lot of ways that it doesn't really fail in a lot of Cube drafts.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason anyone should care what I think about Constructed, because I basically don't play any Constructed, but I don't like companions for Constructed, I have to say, because the good ones are so easy to just free roll, basically. Like, you can free roll Luris or Kahira or Gigantha in a lot of decks without changing anything, basically. And so I don't love that kind of play pattern, but when you have to draft the deck, I think that's where the mechanic really comes alive. And it's a very blunt build around in the sense that it literally says, if you want this extra power, all the cards in your deck have to conform to this restriction. But a build around nonetheless. It's the same as like any other build around. The difference being that it kind of gets around that problem that a lot of more committal build arounds have in singleton environments, which is that I took Living End in my pack one pick one. There's a lot of games where I'm just not going to draw Living End in my deck. So, or I'm going to mill it with my self-mill deck and be like, well, cool. I guess I'm just on plan B. And the really committal build arounds in drafted singleton environments can be very punishing in that sense. And if you're playing at a high power level, a lot of them are going to struggle to hang. And so the companion mechanic is a way to fix that, essentially, where it's like, you will always get the benefit of this build around because you can always pay 3 to put it in your hand and then just go cast it. But you have to have drafted and build a deck around it to sort of satisfy that cost.
Yeah, and critically, when it comes to the feedback of Luris is too powerful for this format, we're talking about, well, the card is interesting and it functions in this way, in a way that like feels more like it's in the spirit of the card, the way that it was designed and intended to be played.
Yeah.
And you can't really have that experience elsewhere. So when you're choosing, should I have this card or not, it's not just about, is this card of a reasonable power level? It's all of these factors. And the fact that you want to have that unique experience and that opportunity to play this card in this way just outweighs that power level disparity, even if it is there.
Yeah. And I'm comfortable with it. Decent power delta in my cube. Like, I also run Gaia's Cradle and Ancient Tomb and other cards that are very, very powerful. And I think some people that think Luris is a bigger problem would argue that obviously you don't draw those cards every single game, and that is true, but I also don't think a 6-mana 3/2 is blowing the doors off of anything. I get that it draws you a card. I get it. Trust me. I understand the companion mechanic is very powerful.
It draws you like 2 cards.
I don't need it explained to me, but it hasn't been my experience. And here's the thing. The experience of me and the people I play with in person is really all that matters. Like, we've said before that if some, cabal of the 8 best Magic players of all time got locked in an Airbnb and drafted my cube 1,000 times and came out and said, here are the objectively best cards, they're huge power outliers, blah, 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 here's the win rates. If my group never experiences that, it don't matter. Like, until Luris is ruining people's experience in our drafts, it's going to stick around.
Are you saying we're not 8 of the best Magic players of all time and we're not locking ourselves into...
Maybe like top 20. I don't know. No, we're not quite there, Anthony. We still have a lot to climb.
Yeah, and I don't feel like I'm climbing these days.
Yeah, I'm not climbing much either, honestly, to be fair. I wanted to do a little bit of follow-up. And I want to ask you...
I swear to God, if we talk more about Cling to Dust...
Okay, well, I'm going to mention it briefly because we have to follow, because we talk so much about it. I'm getting trolled about it constantly, which is fine. I welcome that, everybody. But I do want to follow up on Cling to Dust and Field of the Dead. And I got to say, Anthony, I want you to help me if you're willing. Be a friend. If I start flapping my lips about a card I have not played in my cube before, just remind me to pump the brakes, because on both these cards, my expectations, which we talked about at length on the podcast, were different from reality, from playing both of them, and different in ways that I ended up liking both of these cards a lot more than I thought I would. Starting with Cling to Dust, we talked about this a few episodes back on a single card discussion. I basically had expressed that I was wary to run this card because it seemed like 99% of the time it was a free cantrip that any black deck gets to play. You just exile some fetch land and draw a card whenever you want, which is a very reasonable filler card. Just a cantrip is fine to stick in pretty much any deck in my environment. And then occasionally has the upside of being a huge blowout against a Snapcaster Mage, a slightly less huge blowout against like an Uro or a Croxa or something like that. That Grave Hate occasionally being extremely relevant. I was very wary of those play patterns. And where I was wrong on Cling to Dust, I think, is not that those blowouts are still undesirable to me and will still happen with a pretty small rate. Like, I don't think it's going to happen all that often. But where I was wrong is that the way that the card actually plays, in my experience now, is way more than just a regular cantrip that you just jam in your deck. I played this in 2 drafts, and in the first draft, in the first 2 matches, I had already escaped it like 3 times. It happens a lot in my experience in my environment that you actually use it as a late game value engine. And I actually also used it as a face up Grave Hate spell, which I like the escape mode as Grave Hate. Like being able to escape it, your opponent sees it's there, they know it's an option. I had a game where I was playing against a mono red aggro deck, and I was dying to an Earthshaker Kenra that I could not afford to block or use a removal spell on because I couldn't beat the 4/4 haste that was going to come down the next turn because my opponent had 6 mana. And so I had to wait until I could maneuver things to remove it and also Cling to Dust it in the same turn so that they couldn't eternalize it back. And that was great. I loved it. That felt great. So Cling to Dust has turned out to be, to me, actually like a very cool Swiss Army knife. And because all of those other modes are so much more relevant, because it is actually relevant to gain life sometimes, because it is relevant to, use the face-up escape mode to hate a thing out of the graveyard, because it is relevant to just have it be a late-game card advantage engine where you just draw more cards when you need to. Because of all that extra value it brings to the table, it puts so much on the pro side of the scales that con of occasionally blowing out a Snapcaster Mage or whatever is much less of a con to me.
Okay, I'll let you know next time you do that.
Anyway, so that's where my official stance on Cling to Dust these days. I like the card. It is good. I will tolerate the fact that sometimes it will lead to occasional blowouts. And people rightfully have brought up that there are lots of other effects that are in my cube that can lead to similarly narrow and similarly huge blowouts. And the examples given are like, you Flicker Wisp their giant Stonecurl Serpent. It's like, yeah, that's not really what Flicker Wisp is supposed to do, but sometimes you get to like totally get them with it. And so, yeah, there are definitely cards that just have edge cases where they're way better and just happen sometimes. And if I can't avoid it, I'd like to, but here are the pros of Cling to Dust in my environment. I introduced it a month ago by saying this is a card that, by all of my stated cube goals, I should love. And sure enough, I do in fact love it, actually.
Hey, it's great when a plan works out.
Did you play with or against Field of the Dead in my environment?
I did play with Field of the Dead just in one game. I think it was a grid draft I did with you, and I don't think I ever actually made a zombie. I think that deck was a little bit not quite the right home for it.
Yeah. I played against Field of the Dead. I've not played with it yet in my own queue, but I've played against it quite a bit, both in that grid draft and then more relevantly in a fully person draft we did earlier. And this card is so much better than I thought it was going to be. My skepticism about it was 7 lands is so many lands. How often is this going to actually be relevant? And the answer is a lot. And the only way I can describe the difference, I think, here in like my expectations versus the reality, like the reality is it's the same. Like it's an objective reality. You need 7 lands, and a lot of games in my cube you don't get to 7 lands. That still remains true. That hasn't changed. What has changed for me is I didn't predict how bad it would feel or how like powerful it would feel when your opponent just goes, turn 5 Golos, get Field of the Dead. Now, if they have a fetch land, you just lose because they're going to make 2 zombies next turn, and that's probably it. Like, there's just too much value. The game is over from that point on. And so at that point, it's like they get to 5 and have a Golos, and then the game feels like it's basically over. And that's a much smaller requirement. It's a much lower bar to clear than thinking about 7 uniquely named lands or whatever. And it's not quite that simple, but the emotional experience of having my like low to the ground Jund deck on the other side of the table, I'd gotten them to like 12 or whatever, and then they played Golos and got Field of the Dead, and I was like, oh boy, that's going to be a real big problem.
I think there's a couple factors that add into that. One is that obviously you're focusing on the cost, quote unquote, of you're going to need 7 unique lands, so that is going to take a long time to get there, right? And if you think of it that way of saying, well, I'm adding a 7 drop to my deck, that's not really a fair way to evaluate it, because
no, you're not paying 7 mana.
You're not paying 7 mana for it, and you're not even including a 7 mana spell. You're still including a land that does tap for mana, so that the deck building cost is just so much less than putting an expensive card in your deck. And then the other thing of just it being free. Once you have it in play, you have your 7 lands, you're just getting that value for free, which means you can be doing other stuff at the same time.
Yeah.
And free effects are, every time we see them, they turn out to be extremely powerful and often in a way that is difficult to evaluate.
So yeah, I was definitely wrong about how powerful that would feel. And I am convinced it is extremely powerful, which I got a tip of the hat to Parker. Parker, a friend of the show, did tell me that card's kind of broken. And I was like, Parker, 7 lands is so many lands. How broken could it possibly be? And it's very, very good. It is also a build around. I don't think you just jam it in any deck. It's kind of right in that sweet spot for me of you have to do a little work for it, but the payoff is big, and it's not just a total free roll in any deck. You have to like be committed to the bid a little bit, which I like.
So you misevaluated it in terms of power level. Did you also change your evaluation in terms of how much you enjoy the card?
I will admit that right now I am drawn to it like a siren song just because I want to feel the power myself. So the next time I draft the cube, if I have a chance to take it, I'm almost certainly going to, and I will force some kind of lands deck with it, I think, because I want to feel what it's like to play it. So I don't know if that means I like it or not. I haven't got enough reps to know if I like really love the play patterns or not. But I am intrigued by the idea of a card that basically says get to 7+ lands and you will probably win, which I think is kind of an interesting sub goal to put in a game.
And when you get bored of it, you can just move off it.
Exactly. That's the thing. And maybe I will. Maybe in fast forward 18 months and that card's too powerful, tired of playing all those stupid zombie tokens and just running away with games.
Or you'll just end up adding Scape Shift and Crucible of Worlds.
I have been thinking about Primeval Titan again.
Yeah, that fits right in there.
It does fit right in there. And the thing is, it's like, I have historically been like, Primeval Titan is like a pretty forgettable 6-drop. Like, I think I convinced you to try it out in the regular cube because I was like, this is basically just Colossal Dreadmaw with some flavor text.
Hey, don't hate on Colossal Dreadmaw.
That's not a drag on Colossal Dreadmaw. My point was just that 6 mana, 6 instances with trample usually win the game if your opponent can't remove them in most Magic, your cube included. My cube included. I have a lot of removal running around, and so the question is, how bad is the fail case of you got 2 lands instead? Prior to Field of the Dead, it's a pretty big fail case. Like, you were already at 6 mana, you got more mana, essentially. Like, the lands you could have fetched in my cube, like, you could have gotten a creature land, you could have gotten a Gaia's Cradle, which is a lot more mana, but still just mana. You could have gotten a Wasteland or something, maybe a Shelldock Isle if you were a green-blue deck.
And critically, in this cube, and I think a lot of other higher-powered cubes, like, once you're casting your 6-mana spell, it's not like you have a ton of cards that you're still able to take advantage of that ramp with.
Right, you won't have any more cards, and you will also probably be very close to dead if your opponent has done anything. Like, by the 6-mana point of the game, a lot should have shaken out one way or the other, and so you probably need something decisive. And what's not decisive is go get 2 lands and then get your Primeval Titan Infernal Grasp and you die. So I've been thinking about it a little bit because it might be, I think people would be excited to draft it and do gross land stuff. And I wonder if between Field of the Dead and Urza Saga, if there are enough colorless lands now that make it worth it. I don't know. But
Urza Saga is a hell of a card.
But I might find out. The card is really something.
Beautiful design.
Is it a beautiful design?
I think so. I mean, it's just all hangs together so well. Like, I think it actually does do a great job of sort of reflecting the story in a mechanical way, and more importantly, the fact that they can take Urza, which is a land type, and Saga, which is an enchantment type, and make a card named Urza Saga.
That's why the card exists. I feel
100%.
Like.
Yeah, I think it was designed by one person all at once. They never play tested it. They were just like, "This is too good. We have to print this."
There you go. I was listening to the Receivables episode about Modern Horizons 1 this week. I'm in the back catalog of the Receivables. It's an older episode. But they were talking about how just brilliant the design of Urza, the actual creature card from Modern Horizons 1 was. And I have to agree. It's like the perfect design. The way that they made an iconic character that refers back to multiple other iconic cards in the form of like Mox Sapphire and Thran Temporal Gateway, which was printed in Urza's block set.
Hi, everybody. It's Andy here, coming to you from the future. Just to say that I screwed up the card name. It's Temporal Aperture, not Thran Temporal Gateway. I cannot explain to you how painful it is to edit this podcast and hear me mess up a card name. Very tilting.
And made it playable, but not broken. Didn't get banned anywhere. Like, it's a real triumph, I think. That card is kind of a masterstroke of design, I think.
It's funny that like one of the big issues in early Magic was they designed these characters, these planeswalkers that were too powerful. Like, how we can't have these characters in the game because we have, like, in a flavor perspective, have made them omnipotent almost.
Yeah.
And so they sort of had this big story where, like, a bunch of planeswalkers lost their spark, and there was the mending, and they sort of rebalanced the flavor so that they could actually make the mechanics work around it. And then they go and just print this card anyway. And it's an extremely powerful card.
It is, but it enabled like new decks in Modern, as I understand it, that were not possible without it, but also has not been like totally overpowered. I don't know. It strikes me as a very hard needle to thread. If you were like, hey, we're going to print a new Mishra card in Modern Horizons 3, and we want it to be relevant in Modern, but not too good, and also tie together all these aspects of the story, and also refer back to other cards, and like have all that stuff tied in. It's just very impressive, I think.
I mean, you say that, but the Brothers War, the set, is coming up, and I gotta say, I'm pretty excited about it.
I am too. I love Magic cards.
I love Magic cards, and I love sci-fi more than like anything else. And to go back, I think a lot of people are looking at some of these sets that are coming up and being like, "Ugh, I like the fantasy aspect. Why are we like introducing the sci-fi?"
Yeah, people don't like change.
But I think it's a return to it. Like, there was so much, like, all the cool architecture of the like Phyrexian portals.
Phyrexia is pretty sci-fi.
It's some good stuff.
Just like the Phyrexians, I feel like are a sci-fi style threat.
Oh yeah,
More than they are a fantasy style threat.
if anything, they are the Borg.
Yeah.
Which maybe there's a fantasy skinning of that I'm not really familiar with.
I don't know.
but-
Fantasy threats always feel like there's a lot of individual identity in it. It's like,
Yes.
that is the dragon.
That's,
and
that's it. That's probably my whole thing about why I like sci-fi more than fantasy is who needs...
it's not about the
who needs
individual.
heroes and individuals.
Sci-fi is
Let's-
really not about the individual, which the Phyrexians, well, I mean, they have the Praetors and stuff, but you got to have
Yeah,
characters.
that's my least favorite part of them.
Yeah, they're not my favorite either, to be honest. Anyway, that's follow-up on Field of the Dead and Cling to Dust, both cards in the Bud Magic Cube. I don't see either coming out anytime soon, and if either of them were to come out, it would probably be Field of the Dead for maybe being too good if we discovered that you can just do that too reliably.
I don't know, but maybe the Luris track is the real overpowered.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, is that depending on who you're talking to at what time of day it is, it's either Luris is too good, or Field of the Dead is too good, or Ancient Tomb is too good. I want a bunch of competing too goods to just shake out somehow.
So your cube, you want every card to be way overpowered, and I want every card in my cube to be slightly below average.
I don't want every card to be overpowered, but I want every card to fill a role. And a lot of the roles are, I want this card to be exciting and make people want to draft it. To come back to what you said earlier about just the novelty, it's actually kind of a deep callback, but something I noted in the most recent draft of my cube in person was there was a couple players that were very excited about recent additions to the cube in the like white aggro territory. Specifically, these players were excited about Esper Sentinel and Intrepid Adversary, which are, if you've listened to me talk about them on our set review episodes, cards that I think are fine. I think they're playable in my aggressive decks. They're in my cube right now because I like the play patterns they lead to, and I want to see specifically how Adversary plays out. I like disruptive 1-drops that have a lot of depth and variety to them. I like diversifying the 1-drop slot and not having a bunch of Savannah Lions. But I don't think either of these cards is like extremely powerful. I wouldn't call either of them a high pick for the white aggro deck. They both feel like middle of the pack kind of picks to me. But multiple players in our play group were like, these are the cards that make me excited to play white aggro. And of course I was like, well, yeah, of course. That's the new thing. It makes total sense. Like, you've played Thalia 1,000 times, even though I think Thalia is just a tier and a half better than both of these cards. You're just going to take the card you haven't played before because you want to see what it's like. You want to see what you can do with it, which is valid.
For sure. I mean, that's always going to be part of Magic and cube design. It's sort of funny. I think we like to think of cube as this sort of special way to play Magic. That
So special.
It is special, but we like to think that the fact that Wizards is printing new cards doesn't really affect cube design, and we can just sort of do our own thing and ignore that if we want to.
In theory, you could.
In theory, you could. I think that for most people, the fact that the game is continuing to evolve is really so much about the format.
Yeah. And also just, you could, of course, dive into the back catalog of Magic cards you have not explored before. When Jason was on the show, he talked about having 20,000 cards he still hadn't reviewed yet for his cube inclusion, so he didn't have time to look at new cards. You can always do that, but it's definitely more fun.
And I would recommend that.
Oh, it's for sure. And I would say with every cube edition, I'm always pulling in an older card or two, or a card that I overlooked when I'm making changes with new sets. But part of what's fun about cube is that we kind of have this like parallel world, I feel like, where it's fun to be talking about the same cards everyone else is talking about. Like, I like watching the decks people are brewing in Standard or the new Modern decks people brew when Modern Horizons comes out to see what these cards do and how they shake out. And I like that I'm thinking about those cards about at the same time. And even though I'm not thinking about them in the exact same terms, I think it contributes to this like sense of a community and helps make knowledge transportable.
Absolutely. I think that's the key part, that you're actually able to gain some data when you're just like, oh, this like weird card from original Theros that never made it in any standard format. I think it's awesome potentially, but it is much harder to have a conversation about it because no one's brain space is there.
Right. So you have to like, I want to talk about this card. Let me give you some context about it.
Yeah.
Let me explain the cube. Let me just put it in. But everyone is already thinking like, oh, here's what. I think Asika's Chariot is a great example of this effect. Asika's Chariot did not really see a ton of play. My understanding is it didn't see play in Standard basically at all when Eldraine was still in Standard, because Eldraine had, frankly, some kind of pushed cards that really defined the Standard metagame and pushed out a lot of other strategies. When Eldraine left, there was a kind of vacuum left behind, and in that vacuum, Asika's Chariot has proven to be a very viable Standard card, also in combination with some new cards, but Asika's Chariot has really kind of risen to prominence in Standard in recent weeks. This is one of the reasons I like having the data from the Cube surveys, because we know when Call Time was first spoiled that people were kind of excited about Asika's Chariot, but I would say it wasn't the talk of the town. The talk of the town with that set was Usher the Fallen, Doomscar, Starnheim Unleashed. Even a card like Valky scored higher than Asika's Chariot. About 30% of the people that responded to that survey were testing Asika's Chariot, got a rating of 2.2. It was like a fine card. Still near the top of the list, but 30% is not a huge percentage. I think since it's been in Standard, you will see a lot of people have added Asika's Chariot to their cubes, rate it more highly in their cubes, and I would guess, my gut, that if we fast forward a couple months from now, maybe even, I'm going to check right now. Check right the heck now, because we can check it on Cube Cobra. I would bet that more people are going to be playing Asika's Chariot in the long run than Starnheim Unleashed or Valky, at least, certainly. Probably than Doomscar, too, honestly.
Oh, I absolutely believe that. I think a similar place where we see that kind of effect is the lag with cards from a lot of supplemental sets, where the initial interest in, especially like the new Commander decks, is usually very low within at least sort of the corner of the Cube community that we're getting information from. But as soon as one of these cards sort of starts to slowly get some prominence, like Ethereal Forager recently, there is this sort of slow build-up. So clearly people are more engaged with cards based on not just what the cards do and how they function in their particular cube, but based on that conversation and that sort of metagame around these cards.
Yeah, so this is, I think, such a great example of this. And again, we're reaching a kind of specific subset of the cube design world with our survey. It's not everybody, but still, these numbers are different enough that I think it's quite stark. So again, just look at the numbers here. Asika's Chariot, 30% of our respondents were testing Asika's Chariot, and it was 40% of respondents were planning on testing Starnheim Unleashed. They got about the same rating in the survey. As of right now, today, Tuesday, October 19th, Starnheim Unleashed is in 1,500 cubes on Cube Cobra, and Asika's Chariot is in 2,800. So
wow.
Double, basically, even though less people said they were testing it. I think that's largely attributable to the fact that it's doing stuff in Standard, and people are realizing what the card is capable of and seeing the kind of shells it can go in and just getting excited about it.
And there's two sides to this. Like on one hand, it's great to sort of like, we can't focus on everything all the time. So the community focusing on sort of a subset of, and especially the newest cards, makes a lot of sense. And if you're sort of prepared for that, it makes you more prepared to engage in the community when you know what they're going to be interested in. On the other hand, it is disappointing to me because I am a cube designer that wants to go through the huge back catalog of Magic cards and pick out things that just haven't really been played or do something totally unique and interesting. And that can be just as satisfying as a literal new card, but it is much harder to have those conversations.
You just want them to print Puppet Conjurer tomorrow so that we can talk about Puppet Conjurer in the zeitgeist again. It can blow up Standard.
I want them to print fixed Puppet Conjurer.
Now, what is fixed? Not a blue activation?
It's not a blue. The activation is black or generic. I'll take either one. I want it to be a zombie. I want it to make zombie homunculuses and also
zombie homunculuses.
Figure out how that creature
Are those
type.
both races? Does that work?
Yeah.
I guess, zombie would be a class, not a race, because you can have any kind of zombie anything.
You can put as many creature types as you want on a thing.
There is definitely a race class breakdown. You
Yeah,
don't see any human elves in Magic.
You literally do. Half-elf monk.
What?
Got him.
Well, thoroughly dunked on.
Anyway, Puppet Conjurer 2.0. It'll be great. Really looking forward to it. Thanks, Gavin.
Yeah, I hear you. I think I agree. There's like it cuts both ways. There's a pro and a con of having this influence from what's going on in the broader Magic community. What I would want people to do is just be more conscious of it, because I think if people were conscious of it and speak less objectively about like, well, these are the best cards, I don't know what you're talking about. I see people all the time say like, well, you can't play creatures from 2021 alongside creatures from 2006 because they're just not compatible because creatures have come so far. And it's like, that's not true. You can definitely make that work. I mean, you can't do it blindly. If you're just trying to run the most powerful cards and you're not giving any thought to how you compose the environment, then yeah, sure, you're probably going to find that a lot of the old creatures are going to be outclassed by a lot of the new ones. But there is nothing that is broadly invalidating all of the cards in the passive Magic, even though it is harder and more effort to turn an attentive eye to them because they are not part of the current zeitgeist.
Yeah, there are a lot of things that I think we take for granted which aren't in themselves negatives, but because we don't really see them, because they're kind of implicit and we are taking them for granted, it means that the other space kind of is less available because we're just not seeing that space.
How do you mean?
Just like everything that you just said.
I agree with big words.
Small words in the wrong order.
Why say big word when small word do? That's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I hope everybody gets to cosplay as their favorite Magic character for Halloween. Go carve a pumpkin with a mana symbol, post it on the Magic subreddit, get 150 upvotes. That's what everyone does this time of year. What? You made a face.
Should we have a pumpkin carving competition?
And cube? Pumpkin and cube?
Oh, I was more thinking for our listeners, but also, yeah.
Oh. What do you want to give them? What's the prize for the pumpkin carving competition?
That's a great question. A jack-o'-lantern, but the Magic card.
Okay, here's what we're going to do. Impromptu pumpkin carving competition, and you will receive a foil signed jack-o'-lantern signed by both Anthony and
Hell
I.
yeah.
If you send in the pumpkin that makes us the happiest. So send those pumpkins to mail at luckypaper.co. As a reminder.
Actually, let's give them a choice. Either they can have this jack-o'-lantern, or they will be allowed to send me a jack-o'-lantern foil signed by them, and I will put it in my Turbo Cube.
There you go. That's a powerful choice. Do you want to have your name on the jack-o'-lantern in the Turbo Cube for the rest of time? That card's never getting cut from the Turbo Cube. It's so good. That is an option available to you. Anyway, send those pumpkin pics to mail at luckypaper.co or hit us up on the Discord or social media. As a reminder, this is your last opportunity to get any voice memos of memories or reflections from Cube Tutor you want to get in before our episode comes out next week. And as another reminder, you have exactly a week from when this episode airs to get all your data off of Cube Tutor before it goes away forever. So our episode next week will be that Memoriam episode. All the music for Lucky Paper Radio is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Anthony and I. After work, just go sit in his basement and just shoot the shit about Magic cards. Thanks for shooting the shit, Anthony.
Thanks for shooting the shit, Andy.
If you have any leftover Halloween candy, you know where to send it this year. I know you don't really like Halloween. You're probably in a decent spot to get some trick or maybe not. You're kind of the end of the block.
I don't think so.
It would be a committed thing. This is a nice long block, but you're the end of it.
It's
so
kind of a nice little tucked away spot. I really like it. So we used to have a tradition just among our friends that we would make Halloween candy every year. Obviously, we're not seeing our friends as much these days, but maybe I'll make some Halloween candy and drop some little bundles around.
Every year I make different gummy bears, and if you looked at my gummy bear making kit in our cabinet, you would think I was definitely into making edibles. But it's actually just my attempt to make sour bears every year.
They have enough vitamin, or what is it actually citric acid?
Citric acid. I have a whole ass tub of citric acid sitting in my pantry.
Yeah, so you not only have the whole gummy making kit, you also have some jars of white powders. Yep. It's definitely a little bit suspicious.
It's pretty sus. I'm not gonna lie.
Well, like I mentioned at the top of the show, just to bring it around, I definitely like toffee, like interesting, complex caramelized sugars. That's the where it's almost bordering on the savory. That's the kind of candy I'm interested in. So
it's funny because that is like, I love candy. I have such a sweet tooth. I'm like a big child. I'm a child blown up to 6'1".
That's what all people are.
Yeah,
maybe not that specific height.
But I just the toffee just doesn't do it for me.
Really?
Well, it gets stuck in my teeth.
It does.
I got bad teeth.
Yeah.
Like I'm always a little afraid it's gonna rip some of my teeth out.
It's a bad combination of the toffee and the chocolate, and then if you have some nuts in there, it's just can be a real hazard.
It's true.
All right, well, not gonna bring you any toffee.
Beep boop. Wait a minute. Hold on. No, wait. Hold on. I want the toffee. I'll still have it. It's my least favorite of the candies, but I'll still. All right.